Hello dear chess friends, I'm International Master Andrey Ostrovskiy and you're welcome to the lesson dedicated to basic defenses against the checkmate. So the first stage is just to realize that the threat of a checkmate exists. For example, in this given position we can notice that black has a drawback, black has all pawns placed on the 7th rank so that the king has no chance to occupy the 7th rank if white checks the king along the back rank, so that there is a threat of rook e8, and after exchange of rooks there will be a checkmate. Usually there are several ways of preventing the checkmate. For example, in this situation, black can control the e8 square, the key one in this situation, with another rook. For example, rook goes to a8, and now we can see that both rooks control e8 square, so that white simply has no rook e8 move. In this case, black simply wins the material as a result. But this defense, rook to a8, leaves the drawback still present in the position, the pawns on the 7th rank. So there is a better defense. It is just to play h6, getting rid of the main drawback so that there is no longer threat of a checkmate along the back rank. So if rook invades, then after exchange the king simply has the square h7 to escape. So as we can see, this method of defense can be called the getting rid of the drawback that actually makes checkmate possible. Let's have a look on other examples. In this position, black's king side is vulnerable, so it is a typical pattern, and white can play queen to h6, and we can see that pawn f6 controls g7 square, the queen controls this square as well, so there is a direct threat of a checkmate on g7. So the efficient defense against the checkmate also based on realizing the drawback, realizing the concrete threat. This usually helps to understand what do you need actually to prevent a checkmate. So for example, the checkmate is possible because of the weakness of g7 square that definitely lacks defense from black's side. So how to prevent this typical checkmate? Queen goes to f8. In this position, it is possible to bring the queen to protect g7 square. At the same time, it is the offer of exchange, so without queens it will be extremely hard for white to attack, to achieve anything, and black is safe, black is okay now. So queen g7 gives white nothing. In this case, black simply takes on g7 twice, and black even has the extra pawn. So the checkmate is prevented. Probably after queen f8, white has to go away with the queen or to take on f8, and well, black keeps playing. There are a lot of different possibilities to protect your king, to prevent a checkmate, so mainly it depends on the concrete pattern. For example, here we have a pattern of attack against h7 square. We can notice this aggressive knight on g5, which exerts pressure on h7, and at the same time, white's queen, which is also very active here, exerts the same pressure on h7. So there is a threat of queen takes h7 checkmate. So in this position, black has several defenses. So the one is just to play g6. This move helps black to cover diagonal b1 h7, so that making queen e4 no longer that efficient, no longer that dangerous. So h7 is no longer possible to occupy with the queen, which makes it safe, and black prevented a checkmate. This defense, however, has a drawback because after g6 we can notice that black simply weakens very important squares around the king. They are f6, that is no longer protected by the pawn g7, as well as h6, so the same problem. So how to prevent this checkmate without making position that weak on the king side. So we can see that white's attacking mechanism is based on the power of two pieces. So one of these pieces is the knight on g5. So in many cases it is possible just to eliminate one of the attacking pieces to prevent a checkmate. It is exactly this case. So we can see that bishop e7 can simply take the knight on g5, and after h takes g5, white no longer has a threat of a checkmate. Of course, white is still a bit better because of the better pieces, so they are just more active than black's ones, but the main threat, so actually the worst scenario, is prevented, so there is no checkmate. By the way, you have to be careful in the initial position because it looks like there is also one more defense. It is to play f5. But this move has several drawbacks, and it is actually a very bad one. So first of all, we can see that e6 becomes weakened, but it is not the main problem. Actually, after f5, white can take this pawn en passant, and after that, we can see that white simply regains the threat of taking on h7 with the checkmate, and at the same time, pawn f6 now attacks the bishop e7. So actually black still can play g6 to prevent the checkmate, but in this case white simply takes on e7 and well, has the extra minor piece. Of course black can take on f2 here, but after that king simply goes away and white has a technically winning position. In this example, we come back to this very common pattern with the pawn f6 and queen on h6. So queen goes here to create a threat of a queen g7 checkmate. We can notice that the rook on f8 prevents black from playing queen f8, protecting g7 square, but black still has a great defense against this checkmate. So you should never forget that everything depends on the attacking mechanism. So here we can see that white creates a threat of a queen g7 because of the queen and because of the pawn. As we already discussed, in many cases it is possible to eliminate one of the attacking pieces to prevent a checkmate, right? So here, at first glance, it doesn't look like black has a chance to capture f6 pawn, but if we think of the position carefully, we can notice that queen actually can get to f6 after the check. So it is another typical method of defense, so get into key squares after winning the tempi. So here, after queen b6 check, as we can see, the king on g1 is under attack of the queen, so at the moment white simply has no time to make queen g7 move. King goes away and queen takes f6, simply eliminating this attacking pawn, after which there is no checkmate. Black has a chance to perform the same maneuver of winning the pawn f6, gaining a tempo, after taking the rook on e1. So you should never forget that there are a lot of different possibilities usually, and you have to choose the best one. So queen b6, queen f6 is just enough to prevent a checkmate, but what about just taking the rook, because it is also a tempo move, attacking the king. King has to go to h2, it is the only move, and after king h2, black has again the check, attacking the king and the pawn simultaneously, and the next move, queen takes on f6. This line is of course much better than the previous one, because here black managed not only to prevent the checkmate, but at the same time won a lot of material, won the rook. And the final example, also very important pattern, defendant pattern to memorize. So we can see that white is in the attack. We can notice this rook and the queen attacking h7. So it is not actually the threat of the checkmate, but just imagine that there is no possibility for the king to go away to f8. In many cases, it is true, and it might be a threat of a checkmate, right? So queen h7. So how to prevent the checkmate in this situation, how to prevent at least the capture of the very important pawn h7. So there is a direct closure of the diagonal b1 h7, which is g6, but we already discussed that moves of this sort are quite bad usually because they weaken a lot of squares around the king. In this case, they are f6 and h6, so white simply has the access to dark squared weaknesses on the king side. So how to prevent the checkmate better? Again, there is a possibility to play h6, but once again, it makes nothing to prevent the danger, the general danger on the king side, because still white has very active pieces there, and white can continue creating some threats, some annoying threats. So in general, pushing pawns on the king side or queen side, so it depends on where your king is placed, is not a good idea because every move weakens something. So usually you have to avoid pushing pawns on the side where your opponent attacks. So in such a situation, black has another very important method of defense. It is the usage of the X-ray possibilities of heavy pieces. So in this concrete situation, it is the X-ray possibility of the queen. So queen goes to b1. Very good move, very active one. And we can see that from b1 through queen f5, black's queen just controls h7 pawn, which prevents white from taking this pawn, because now if queen takes on h7, then queen takes h7, rook h7, and king h7, and black simply wins the material. And if rook takes h7, then queen takes queen, also winning the material. So to queen b1, the queen has to take the queen or to go away somewhere. So in both cases, black prevents the worst, and black created no weaknesses on the king side. After, let's say, queen takes b1 and rook takes b1, we have absolutely equal rook ending with the equal material and equal chances. Thanks a lot for your attention. See you next lessons.